I think the thing that I like most about this in particular argument that really resonates with me is because of the fact that it forces atheists to prove that God is not only existent in our world, but it is not possible for God to exist in any possible world you could imagine.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast, a podcast dedicated to helping you grow in your faith. We're here to coach you up, especially when it comes to thinking for yourself, because that's the only way you're going to know what you believe and why you believe it. My name is Jesse Mayer. I'll be your host, but we cannot do this without the one, the only, the Salty Pastor himself, Dr. Douglas Peak.
Welcome, everybody, to the Salty Pastor. Glad you're listening. And for a couple of you atheists out here who have been listening to our series, glad you're here. Love it when you interact with what we're talking about and you throw in all of those comments. And so all you're doing is proving my point, which I really appreciate you doing that. Plus, you help us get a little bit more, what do they call that in the algorithm? Engagement. So appreciate that. So at least you guys are making some type of decent contribution to the world. Oh!
He is salty today.
That's salty today. Hey, if you could jump over to our YouTube channel, like and subscribe. We'd appreciate it. Help this Salty Pastor podcast continue to grow, because by far and overall, people are really excited about it. We're getting close to 400 episodes. So we have a large body of work over multiple years, and we just love to be a part of your weekly routine that helps you grow in your faith. And one of our goals, is Jesse just said, is we want to coach you up on how to think for yourself, because fluff is not enough. You got to know what you believe and why you believe it.
Absolutely. And we are in our final week, our final proof of 5 reasons why God exists. And I got to say, this one has probably stretched my intelligence muscles the most.
The whole series, or just this week?
The whole series. The whole series has been a long-term workout plan for my brain. And I got to say, I think it's for the best, but it's one of those things where sometimes I got to go back and listen again, or I got to sit and think quietly for a little while. Some of the things that you say, that's not necessarily a new thing I've had to do, but that is something I'm doing specific to this series. So I think that's really been great, and it's helped me solidify the foundation of my faith, which I think is really good, because now I feel more empowered and more prepared to be able to go out and reach other people for Jesus, even some atheists. So it's all about confidence, right, Pastor?
It's all about confidence, yeah. You know, I think we need to have mental strength to navigate this life, and I think confidence is one of the most critical aspects of that. You know, it's very important, because when you know you're standing on solid ground, it really helps you face each day and with a much more positive orientation. And it's a concept, particularly for men, is that each day you have to face with your, so you got to stand up straight, put your shoulders back and your chin up. And even though that's a posture, it reflects an attitude, particularly for men, that makes all the difference in what happens during the day, how you feel about the day, your experience in the day. And that's what we want to help you do, is develop mental strength. One thing you realize is, when you have this confidence, is that you don't have all the answers. You don't even need all the answers. All you actually need is the answers to a few really big questions, like, who am I? Why am I here? What does it mean to be a man or a woman? So that makes the biggest difference in your life. Whatever challenge you face, whatever up or down or obstacle you're working through, that confidence of knowing who you are is huge. So one of the things I really dislike about all these attacks on faith is the attempt to make you feel, less confident, less courageous, less like a man or less like a woman who has the skill set to actually attack the day and experience the day as it was meant to be faced, with this courage and confidence and kind of this solid foundation. The attacks on your faith are meant to make you feel lesser and smaller, unintellectual, And that's just not true. And so that's why I'm happy that we're able to be a voice crying in the wilderness, as I say, because I'll tell you what, I don't think there's a lot of people out there that are actually saying and pointing out the things that we are doing. And so we're not trying to be unique and special. We're just trying to be truthful and share with you kind of the things that we think.
Well, and I think what's super important about just this series in general, like you said, is you don't need to understand. We had a meeting earlier today. You don't need to understand every aspect of every argument. Like you don't need to go out and get a PhD in order to utilize this stuff. The fact that you know it exists and that if someone comes up to you and says, well, did you know blah, 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 science is saying this, then you could say, well, actually, you know, my pastor did a series about this, and I remember him talking something about how the universe is continuing to expand, and that proved something. So I'm going to go look at that, and then you can go back and either study the sermon that you did, or you can listen to the episodes, or you can go look it up on Google. There's a lot of arguments for it on Google if you just know that it exists, right? Half the battle, what is it, the old G.I. Joe saying, knowing is half the battle, right?
Yeah.
And that's really actually true in this, is if all you've ever heard is that science is proving that our faith is not real and that your faith is irrational, then yeah, of course you're going to just kind of think that's true. But the moment you unlock that, oh, actually, no, it is rational, and oh, actually, there are some arguments against these things that you're telling me, evolution, all of these different stuff, then you know where to go looking for it, and that unlocks a whole swath of research that you can go study on your own. And like we said, we're not here to really hold your hand. We're here to coach you, and then you got to go do the work. And so I think this gives you some confidence of being able to walk into situations and say, I may not know all the answers right now, but I know where I can go look for them. And I think that's a big thing.
And having your faith challenged is what grows you. I remember a story, Dr. Peter Kraft, he professor, head of the philosophy department there at Boston College, and he tells a story. He says every year the freshmen would come in, and I'd say, okay, I want everybody who believes in God to sit over here, and everybody who doesn't believe in God to sit over there. And he goes, okay, now I want you to give all the reasons why you believe in God or you don't believe in God. And so he goes, oh, but I want you to switch sides. So all the people who didn't believe in God had to argue as if they believed in God. And he said all the people who did believe in God had to argue as if there was no God. And he says what was so fascinating about this experience every single time is he said the people who believed in God had the best arguments against God. And the people who didn't believe in God, they tried to argue as if, the Santa Claus existed.
Right.
Their arguments for his existence were inept. And he goes, and so it showed me over and over and over again is that people of faith who've had their faith challenged know why they believe in what they believe in. And that's why they have such a greater confidence and courage in their life. And people who don't believe in God tend to disbelieve in God for very silly reasons. And so we're here to help you, coach you up. And if your faith is challenged, that's great. And now you don't need to know all the answers. You just know to go, oh, I can go here and find them.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are on our last proof, Pastor. Let's talk about it. What thing? Please tell us it's not more math. That's all I'm asking. No more math.
Well, yes and no. I hate to say it, but this argument, now, before I share it with you, is a little tough to pick because there's a lot of arguments out there, the argument from love. And it's basically, well, if there is no God, then there's no real, true love, right?
Okay.
Number two, there's another one called argument from desire. This is one of C.S. Lewis's argument. And that is, you can't desire something that doesn't actually exist. Now, he doesn't mean in his definition of desire like imagine or dream. He means an actual appetite. And he says the appetite of the heart is for God. So God has to exist. Otherwise, you could never satiate that. So why would that evolve? It wouldn't. So, and then there's the rationale argument from Alvin Plantinga. And his basic point is that, well, if we evolved, then you can't believe or trust that your mind is rational. Right? Because it only exists for evolutionary purposes. So there's no, how do you know it's actually able to come up with truth? So that's a really interesting argument. But the one I'm going to settle on is very abstract, and I think it's going to be hard for some people because it's pure, unadulterated logic, right? So there's no situation, it doesn't start with a premise, which is like a scientific fact or an experience that everybody has experienced.
Is it observable? Like, is it something we can look at?
Nope.
Oh,
nope.
okay.
It's pure mental math. That's all it is. And it's like I said, yes and no. And it's a very old one because it started with Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century.
Okay.
Like 1078.
A long time ago.
Yeah. And so it's purely a brain bender. But philosophers have been arguing over this proof for centuries and centuries, and they can't come to a resolution. People who say it's debunked, it's never been debunked because it's just a real brain twister. But
so put your seatbelts on, everybody. Get ready.
Yeah, here we go. I'll try to lay this out. It says, okay, if there is God, in order for him to be God, he has to be the maximally greatest being in existence. If you can think of something even greater than God, then that would be God, right? So, in other words, just by the fact that you use the term God, God has got to be God, which means nothing can be greater than him. He is the maximally greatest entity existing. He has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect. Yes, in every possible world. Well, what does that mean, possible world? Well, possible worlds are worlds that could be possible but aren't in our reality. And people are like, what in the world are you talking about? Well, what philosophers would say, well, like, for instance, take a unicorn. Are unicorns real in this world?
Not that we found.
No, they are not. But could they exist in another possible world? And your answer would be, well, yeah. Because, it's a horse with a horn on it, right? So that's possible. Okay? Well, so even though they don't exist in our world, they could exist in another world. So that's possible. There's other things like that. Okay? However, there are some things that can't exist in any world, our world or any other world that you could imagine. For instance, a married bachelor. Now, can a married bachelor exist in any world? Well, no, because it is logically what?
Impossible.
Impossible. It's incongruent. Or a square circle.
Yeah.
No, it can't. You see, there's no possible world a square circle could exist in. So once this is mental math. You're saying, okay, I can imagine all these worlds, millions of worlds. In some of them, you could have a unicorn, right? Or maybe even a fairy. But you can't have a married bachelor, and you can't have what? A square circle.
Right.
Okay, so based on that fact. So if a being that is maximally great exists, it would have to exist in not only our world, but every other possible world you can imagine.
Because it's the most maximally powerful thing.
Right. So it would have to exist in every single one. If he doesn't exist in even one possible, reality, then he's not maximally great. Right. So if he is maximally great, then he would have to be maximally great in every single possible world, even ones with unicorns in them or fairies, right?
Okay.
So
I think I'm tracking so far. Yes.
So do you see the logic? This is all mental math. It's all logic. Therefore, if a maximally great being exists in any possible world, he must exist in all possible worlds. Therefore, he exists. Because if you say to yourself, if I can imagine a maximally powerful being in some other possible world, then by logical default, he has to exist in my world as well. So Anselm basically boiled it down to this. If you can consider that God's existence is real, then he must exist based on rational logic. So it's kind of an interesting brain bender, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely has twisted my brain a little bit. I think we have to. Let me repeat back what I heard, and you check it. I think that's been the best way to kind of reinterpret some of these things to make sure I'm understanding, and in turn, hopefully, the rest of our audience is as well. Basically, you're saying to identify something as God in our world or in any world, we have to say, okay, that thing is so big and powerful that it's over everything, right? Like that's
it has to exist.
It has
in
to have the
every
most power.
world that I could even think up.
It has to exist in all of those things, in all those places, and it has to be
Yes.
so powerful that there's nothing above it, right?
Yes.
And because this is where I get a little turned around, is because we think he exists, he does. I'm a little turned around on the therefore portion of this. So you said there has to be a God that is maximally powerful. He has to exist in every single permutation of the world we can think of. Therefore, he exists.
Yeah, and kind of the basic point is because we can imagine that God exists, by default, he has to exist. It's similar to C.S. Lewis's argument from desire. And the way he defines desire is this, is when you're hungry, what do?
Eat.
When you're tired, what do?
Sleep.
Okay, so...
Well, I mean, I would like to sleep. I don't always do that, but yes.
If you're bored, what do?
Play video games.
Video games. Yeah, you see what I'm saying? Is that if you're lonely...
Go find people.
You go hang out with people, right? So for every desire that you have, there is a corresponding what? Answer or solution.
Okay.
Okay. So if we have a desire for God, let me rephrase it. Why would we have a desire for God unless God existed? Because you don't desire things that don't exist.
Or don't, and I mean, especially if you run down the rabbit hole of evolution, if it doesn't immediately solve something, right? Like if it's not, if it doesn't help you survive, then it has no evolutionary benefit. Therefore, you would not need it, right? It would be eliminated in the process.
Yeah, that's the key. It would be eliminated.
So why are we still talking about God? And God exists. I mean, I don't think true understandings of God exist in all parts of the world, but almost if you do a world religion study, you realize there's a lot of people coming up with a very similar answer, short of like the Romans and maybe the Hindus. They're coming up with, there's something bigger and greater. I mean, even the Native Americans have an idea of like the Great Spirit, right?
Yeah.
And that was even before Christianity came along, right? And so there's this innate, what you would say desire, or C.S. Lewis said, desire for, or an understanding that there's something more, right? Like and that should have, if evolution is true, been programmed out of us a long time ago.
Exactly. And the key, in my opinion, is that cultural anthropologists point this out. There's no society out there that doesn't believe in a God or gods. There aren't any except for atheists. That's it. Nobody else.
Okay.
And so the question, the whole point about Christianity isn't that we don't believe in God. It's that, well, how well do we actually understand God? And in every other system, whether it be paganism or even Wiccan stuff or pantheism or Islam or Hinduism or all these things, every single one of them all have the same basic structure, and that is there is a God or gods, and you have to work your way to them. Christianity is so unique because it's the only one where God said, I will come to you, because you're so confused you'll never be able to find me. And so the ontological argument is that ontologically we are wired this way. And so the fact that we desire, the fact that we can imagine, the fact that we can what we end up doing is saying that therefore there must be a God, because ontologically this shouldn't exist. If it was based on evolution, it should have been eliminated millions of years ago.
For somebody that's obviously not me, what is ontological mean? I'm doing this for that viewer that needs it.
Sure,
I know what it is, but I just want to give you the
you're
opportunity
asking
to.
for a friend.
I'm asking for a friend.
Well, ontological, is basically the totality of human experience. It's like when I say, "Oh, I'm going to speak ontologically," I'm not just talking about your flesh or your brain or your personality or this. I'm talking about the complete you, right? I'm talking about the entire experience of you. So
the nature of being me.
The nature of being Jesse.
It's a great thing. I just got to say.
You gotta say, well, that's just it. Is that you can have identical twins, right? And they can.
I have sisters that are identical twins.
Identical twins. They can grow up. They have the same DNA. But would you say that your sisters are
They
exactly
are
the
wildly different people. They happen to look similar, but they are wildly
you talk
different.
about them, you would say, okay, if they both went to the doctor would test them. They'd have the same DNA, the same everything, to be identical. But ontologically, they're complete individuals.
Right.
Okay, so that's to kind of give you an idea of how ontological. So ontologically, when you look at the whole person, guess what? There has to be a God because we think of God, we imagine God, we try to argue there isn't a God. And this is why I say that atheists are so irrational, is because they spend all their time arguing against something they say they don't believe in. Because if they really didn't believe in it, and if it really wasn't a reality, then they and no one else would care. And yet that's the argument constantly over and over. And you can see, just go and read the comments of some of these podcasts on our YouTube channel. You go down there, people who don't like what I'm saying, they say they misquote me, they say all that, and it's all vitriolic. You know what I'm saying? It's like I'm the worst human being that ever lived because I'm making a basic argument that says, well, you rationally in your brain can come to a logical conclusion that God does exist. And these aren't mine. I didn't make them up. Number two, they've never been debunked. And some of these are well over 2,000 years old. So a lot of really, really smart people, smarter than me, smarter than the people who walk on the face of the earth now, have wrestled with these and come up with incredible logical, rational proofs. And so I think the thing that I like most about this in particular argument that really resonates with me is because of the fact that it forces atheists to prove that God is not only existent in our world, but it is not possible for God to exist in any possible world you could imagine. So think of this like if you've seen the Marvel movies, everybody's into Spider-Man and the multiverse and Doctor Strange and the multiverse, and everybody wants to be able to go from universe to universe to universe to universe to universe. And the one thing is, let's say the Doctor Strange movie, right? He goes, every universe he goes to and he pops into, they're all so different, right?
Right.
But what's the one common denominator?
Him.
In every universe, what does
exists.
Doctor Strange look like?
Benedict Cumberbatch.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same actor in every single one. And so you go, So every possible universe has to have either a knowledge of him or a representative of him. So in some of them, he had been killed. In some of them, he was good. In some, he was evil. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But the one common denominator is he was in them. So what you would have to do is say, well, let's say we're in one where he's dead and doesn't exist. You'd have to say, well, he doesn't exist in every single multiverse. Of course, that would take a wonderful plot line for a writer in Hollywood to use, so
right.
They don't want to do that. But that's what an atheist has to do, is say, it's not possible for God to exist, a superior being, in any possible universe that we could dream up. And okay, well, that is, let me phrase it this way. It's impossible to do that.
Okay. So they're basically, it's a de facto argument that they really can't rebuke.
Exactly. And so that's one of the reasons why I like it. It's fun. It's not the strongest argument for God, but I would say this, when you add it to all the other ones, it's very compelling.
Pretty strong.
It gets stronger. And so that's why I say is because since they can't prove that God doesn't exist in any universe, God must exist. What I think is really fascinating is that brings me down to the ultimate statement, is that the biggest argument for God is atheists themselves, in my opinion.
Okay, explain.
Well, in logic, there is a fallacy called argument ad absurdum. And simply what you do is you follow the logical conclusion of the argument to point out how illogical it is. And the biggest problem with atheism is what atheists themselves have said for the last 300 years, well, really 150 years. You go back and you look at famous atheists like Nietzsche, you look at other atheists, and they all say atheism has the same problem, and it's nihilism. It's meaninglessness. And so that is a huge problem. All you have to do is look at atheism and what it produces, right? when you find out the actual impact of atheism, it's not hard to say atheism just doesn't work. Paul says something really interesting in his letter to Timothy. This is one of the last books that Paul is known to have written, and he says something really interesting. And I think he describes a lot of what we're seeing atheism produce in our society today, and that is verse 1 of chapter 3, 2 Timothy. But realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come. For when men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, and I call that, I'm a spiritual person, although they have denied its power. Avoid such men as these. And it's interesting because 2 Peter records something very similar. The Apostle Peter said, know, first of all, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, and they will follow their own lusts. And it's interesting because it seems like today that the favorite thing to do is mocking Christians and mocking Christianity in our society. You know, I think what's fascinating is for the last, 60 years in American society, the promise was that humanism, secularism, atheism would usher in the greatest expansion of human flourishing in all of history. You know, no one would have any need. We'd create a utopia, but all it's done is create what Paul told Timothy would happen in the last days. And he wrote this 2,000 years ago. And what he talked about, I think, is more accurate than what secular humanists and atheists are telling us is happening today. Today, men are lovers of self. They're lovers of money. They're boastful. They're arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents. It just goes on and on and on. And I think what we've witnessed is that the outcome of an increasing influence of atheism is more of a dumpster fire of horror than anything good.
Yeah, I think it's really important if you're being honest, and I mean those atheists that are watching, if you really look at what the world is producing these days, the amount of tragedies, the amount of anger, hatred, all of these different things that are happening, you guys have had the wheel for a while now saying that you're going to usher in this new thing, and it doesn't seem like it's getting that much better. If you're being really honest, right? And so we have to really look at this and say, what is the fruit of what you say is going to be quote unquote better for our society producing? And we're not seeing a lot of great things out of it, right? And you can't even use every president loves to use the phrase, well, I was left with a mess from my previous thing and I'm just trying to fix it and that's why I'm not doing anything good, right? They've been at the wheel for a long time. You can't say that at this point, right? And so I think there's some honesty that needs to happen and really looking at what is the fruit of your labors producing, and it doesn't look really great from at least my side of the fence.
Well, on Thursday we're going to dig into the impact of atheism on society, and the strongest reason for the existence of God, in my opinion, is what happens when people don't believe in God. You know, just a couple of the highlights we'll dig into. Darwinianism exploded onto the scene in 1859. When he wrote The Origin of the Species. Shortly after that, Karl Marx published Das Kapital between 1867 up to about 1890 something, 92, 3, 4, somewhere in there. Then Nietzsche published most of his works between 1879 and 1889. He wrote Thus Spake Zarathustra. He wrote The Antichrist and other works where he laid the foundation for the rise of the new man. He said, you know, human beings are weakened by Christianity. So what happened in 1915? Well, the Bolshevik Revolution happened in Russia, and it ushered in one of the most bloodiest times in all of Europe. I mean, Russia, the body count for communism in Russia is measured in the tens, sometimes hundreds of millions of people, right? That is unbelievable. Right after that, Nazis took over Germany, and they built their entire eugenics program, which was to bring the pure blood Aryan race to power. And the Third Reich was going to last for 1,000 years, was based on Nietzsche's ideology that he articulated in the Antichrist. After that, the Cultural Revolution of Mao Zedong in the 1960s. Some estimates between 40 to 60 million Chinese were killed just during that Cultural Revolution. It's really fascinating today that so many people say, well, the difference is between people on the left, which are communists, right, and people on the right, which are fascists. And so everybody's arguing about, well, where are you on the political line? And I would postulate something totally different, that it has nothing to do with your right or left. It has everything to do with whether you believe in God or not, because those who don't believe in God produce totalitarianism. The body count is higher in the last century, the 20th century, due to the atheistic children of communism and fascism and every other kind of ism. Their body count is higher than anything, any religion achieved in the last 7,000 years combined. And so the notion that it's somebody else's fault is, like you just said, it's just not being honest enough to look at the impact of your own ideology.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. And I'm excited to talk more about that as we dive into this on Thursday, talking about where we're really at as a society, as a world, and where we're potentially going if we continue down this path. So thank you so much, Pastor, for sharing this with us. Thank you guys so much for joining us today, and we'll see you on Thursday here on the Salty Pastor Podcast.
Hey, stay salty and think for yourself.